Hello there, product people. Welcome to the show that supercharges your abilities to become better thinkers, makers, and leaders. I'm your host, Alsawi, and I'm thrilled to have you join me for this exciting episode of Product People. In this episode, we'll explore the importance of projects and programs, what makes enterprise programs successful, the connection between delivering programs and achieving strategic objectives, the challenges that organizations face to innovate, the cyclical nature of the tech job market, and the impact of AI on product people in tech. So if you're interested in how technology, people, and programs come together to create value, you're in the right place. Expect compelling stories, outstanding expertise, and valuable advice that can fuel your own journey with product, design, and leadership. Let's dive right in. Today, I'm joined by two strategic leaders, tech innovators, and transformational change architects, Butler and Sanjiv Purba. Duke has extensive experience in the financial services and banking industries. He has served as a CEO 3 times and has also worked as a CIO-level technology executive. During his career, he successfully led strategy and global transformation programs, managed high-performing teams, and demonstrated strong financial acumen through roles in corporate development. Duke's expertise includes management consulting, emerging technology innovation, strategic leadership, and board-level governance. When he's not at work, Duke takes pride in being a husband and father to 3 daughters. And in his free time, Duke is an avid bass player and is currently a member of the blues band Edwin Johnson and the Rue. Sanjiv is an award-winning transformational executive and board member with over 25 years of experience. He specializes in working with C-suite and corporate boards of mid to large sized companies who are seeking digital transformation and leveraging IT solutions to maximize share price through effective implementation and ongoing operation. On an interesting note, Sanjiv is also a part owner of a comic book store and has authored several graphic and fantasy novels. Without further ado, let's welcome Butler and Sanjiv Purba to the Product People podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you.
All right. I'd love to start from the beginning. And Duke, maybe we'll start with you. What made you pursue a career in tech and how did you get into it?
Yeah, thank you, Elsa. I came into tech kind of in a roundabout way, to be honest. So I went to University of Waterloo. Most of the time I was thinking about engineering. And some of the aspects of project and program management come from that domain, as you well know. And it turned out that my first foray into technology was really more in big programs. And a lot of them were similar to what you do in a software development process, but more physical. And so things like offshore oil and gas would be an example. Some of the programs I worked on back in the day with my own engineering company that I founded with my brother, Paul, were really things like, projects that would deliver an outcome that's physical. So things like oil and gas. And a lot of this, I guess, the technology aspects of that I learned along the way had more to do with things like the one project I'm thinking about is called Terra Nova. We did others on Sable Island and so forth, but a lot of it was things like iceberg scour, things like, controlling the root cause of a catastrophe, like a blowout, and then doing all the financial aspects of that. So everything that you would do in a technology project was part of that in a lot of ways. So things like initiating the project, having a project charter, following, the PMBOK kind of methodology, very much the same as in most of the technology projects I got into later. Mm-hmm. But I guess to fast forward to how I got into actual software, so I ended up doing a Master of Applied Science at Waterloo. That was more technology focused in the traditional sense of software development. And then further did an MBA. So I kind of, the business aspects and the technology aspects, so I was really keen on entering the software world. And that's where I actually met Sanjiv, and we ended up working at Microsoft. And it was during a fun time. It was during the Bill Gates, kind of Microsoft being the biggest and most exciting company on the planet. Very difficult to get in. I think I went through 30 32 interviews over a year, but I ended up in there. And there's no better learning environment for technology delivery than I would say a company like Microsoft that's so focused on high tech. But at the same time, there's always a business outcome. And, again, we got back into things like PMBOK. We had program and project management mandates and managing big teams on projects that would deliver mostly for the banks, telcos, energy sector, an outcome, and they were always like any big program and project, temporary in nature, very complex, and typically involved lots and lots of rigor around delivery and making sure that you actually delivered.
Thank you for sharing. So I didn't know this. So this is obviously learning for me as well. And I knew you for many years now. Sanjiv, I'd love to know and hear your story on how did you get into tech?
I started doing some business courses in high school and I took a programming course and I just started liking it. And we could do some really cool things from a business, but also just from a gaming perspective and writing small snippets of code to do things on the screen. That was really fascinating to me. And then when I got to university, I started taking computer courses just out of interest. And then that became a passion. And so I started developing, came out as a programmer, graduated with a degree in computer science and a minor in political science, and then just started entering the corporate world and working with business users, implementing systems with them, taking them through the entire SDLC, SDLK and SDLC methodology. I just found that very gratifying and really felt passionately for the industry as a whole. From there, I moved into architecture management. And so half my career has been consulting for organizations like Deloitte and Microsoft and IBM, KPMG, and the other has been as a corporate executive, CIO, global CIO, and COO as well.
All right, thank you. You said it's just a mix, Sanjiv, political science, computer science. Duke, you also have a number of side passions, and I want to ask you about this intersection. How have your side passions influenced or maybe complemented your professional work in tech, and what role do they play for people in their overall careers? So Sanjiv, I'd love to start with you.
I think they're very related, quite frankly. I think that, there's creativity, there's logic, kind of getting things done. And that's very much IT. It's gathering requirements and then building a solution, implementing them. The story is very similar. Politics is interesting because it's really about people, how they interact, how institutions work together. And every meaningful IT project needs a good organizational change program. It needs to understand the politics of the organization, how to roll out a solution, how to get that solution accepted. So the politics was an interesting, very, very related to IT from the people perspective, obviously. From the comic books, I think that's more of a hobby, but it does require, especially writing and appreciating them does require that creativity element, which is really important to designing solutions in IT. So I think from the writing, from the people, and the logic perspective, they're very similar.
Thank you. Duke, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, that's a great question. As you mentioned, Elsawi, at the beginning, I have been a bass player for many, many years. I started on guitar, but I ended up on bass. There is a lot of relevance for how a band is formed. Just like a program or project, you start with a team. They have to be the right resources, the right skill set, and they have to work together for the greater good. So in a band, kind of taught me that even long before I got into technology. And more or less, you have the same sorts of things. You decide to start a band. It's maybe not as formal. You don't have a charter or anything like that, but you have to plan, right? So you have to have a set list. You have to have certain material that you either write, which we did, or you copy from other bands. And in a program, the biggest effort is always in planning. I think where a lot of programs and projects fail, just like bands, is they don't plan, they just do. And the outcomes aren't what's hoped for. And in the case of programs and projects, it's really the sponsorship, the business, what their investment is, what they're hoping to get out of it. Bands, similarly, what is it each person wants to get out of it? Is it fame, fortune, or is it simply just to have fun? I'm more at the stage where this is more of a fun thing. Back in the day, we hoped to make it big, and so there's got to be some, I guess some learnings that you could take to anything, but that would be one of the ones. The other one that's really, I think, similar in the technology field, especially fintech, is anybody that starts a band is likely to fail, and in the fintech or any tech startup, the high probability is that you're going to fail, and it could be you fail temporarily and you recover, which is good, or it could be catastrophic. catastrophic and the project winds down. And more or less, bands come and go. Some of them sustain, like we all know the Rolling Stones are still together, for example, right? That's a case where they had the right team, and yes, they've lost a few members along the way, but they had the right material, they had the right goal in mind, the vision, and they executed for the outcome. I think what's different, a little bit with that band is it doesn't seem to be temporary like a project. It seems to be going on and on and on, which is fascinating at this point. No one would have thought, the Rolling Stones are still touring, in this era. Like when I was a kid, certainly not. But getting back to startups. So startups, they have the right mix, they have the right investment, they have the right technology choice, and that may lead to a stellar outcome. But it's all about the planning and execution, and then making sure that you monitor what's going on. Because if you don't measure success, like if you're a venture-backed startup, you're going to get measured by your VCs or your customers. Your burn rate might be high. You may not last, right? So you have to make sure that you have the right thinking around the schedule, thinking around the budget and the timeline to do, the things that you need to do to be successful.
I see. As you were talking, I was thinking about the difference between projects and products and funding projects versus funding product teams. And one of the things you mentioned is just the nature of projects being temporary and ad hoc despite being complex. And then when you mentioned the example with the band, I was thinking, perhaps it's more of a product team that's persistent and you're working on multiple projects, but it's the same product team and they're not moving from one to the other. So I was trying to draw some sort of analogy around that. But I wanted to ask you, just thinking about everything you said, Duke, and how you started, you were talking about oil and gas and the different kinds of programs that you ran there. Tell us a little bit about, how might someone better understand what is a program and what is a project? How do they differ and why do people need them?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I've always looked at it is, a program is a series of projects or a collection of projects. And it's very much that way in the oil and gas world. So I mentioned Terra Nova. That sounds like it's one project, but it's actually a program. And there's many, many projects underneath the banner of Terra Nova. Some of them could be, things like actually building the platform. Others could be the process delivery of the product itself. And hundreds of different ones flow out of those. So more or less, the person that's running a program typically would be a different skill set than a project manager per se. Both have some commonalities. Like, we mentioned most times projects are temporary and they have an outcome, either a product, service, or something like that. Whereas a program may ultimately have more of a financial, corporate kind of goal, and maybe even some other goals like environmental could be included in some of those. So programs are more in a portfolio of projects with very similar overlap in terms of skill sets, but not exclusively.
I see. Sanjiv, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think I would agree with what Duke, his description. I've always viewed programs as an opportunity to streamline outcomes and resources across a bunch of related programs that are moving towards a kind of a combined strategic roadmap. A program is a piece of that. It's got a defined beginning, a defined end, with some KPIs and deliverables that can be measured, ideally with business value that's been clearly articulated. So I really view projects as a subset of programs, but they can both be enormous or small sizes as well.
We touched on strategy, but not in detail. And I think it's one of the misused words that I see a lot. People kind of add it to a lot of things without maybe understanding what strategy is. And I wanted to dive in a little bit into the relationship between programs, or the intersect between programs, a company's strategic goals. So do they have anything to do with each other? Are they connected? And if so, why is enterprise program delivery important for achieving an organization's strategic goals? Duke, maybe I'll start with you.
So I really follow the Roger Martin school of strategy. So if you don't know Roger Martin, you should look him up. He's, ex-U of T, University of Toronto. He's written for Harvard Business Review. He does follow the traditional school, like Michael Porter was one of the Harvard profs that was really famous for strategy. Strategy is really intricately linked to program programs and projects for sure. And I think increasingly so. So really strategy is about where you play. This is the Roger Martin school, that I mentioned, and how to win. And where to play is really a series of choices, what to do and what not to do. They're ultimately going to affect, the programs and projects down the road. I think some people think of strategy as planning. It's not, and I think Roger Martin would say the same thing. It's linked, so first you got to get the strategy and the choices that you're going to make right. And it's iterative. It doesn't mean that you can't change your mind, but you have to have a vision, and a mission for a company. Ultimately, it could be that the programs and projects are 100% about the strategy. So an example would be, recently we worked on some PayMod programs, and the only reason for that organization to exist is to do that one thing. So the strategy is, either going to be very tactical in the sense that you're just trying to deliver a utility, or the longer term could be things like new things and new technologies. And some of them could be, in the payments realm, could be things like real-time payments that's happening pretty much across the whole world now would be an example. But at the end of the day, you could be abstracted in programs and projects from the strategy. So a lot of the people in a bank, like I've worked in the big banks, a lot of people executing projects and programs may not even have a really good idea what the overall organization strategy is. And they may be just, in some ways, a cog in the wheel. So, somebody has to be the strategic thinker about the whole program. So in a bank, it's like a portfolio of different businesses like wealth management or capital markets, trading and things like that, or retail banking that most of us are familiar with, things like bank accounts and mortgages. But each of those have to roll up to a strategy, right? And the bank I'm talking about, they have a portfolio that has a strategy, to basically offer services that are complementary, but also could be, countering some of the downturns in some of the portfolios with others. So some things will be doing well, like capital markets could do well when retail isn't, and vice versa, things like that. But long-term, programs and projects really do need to link to the strategy. I think that gets lost in some of the bigger organizations. And depending on how successful the top-down, communication of the strategy is, there could be either really great execution of the strategy, or there could be disconnect. And that comes down to communications. It comes down to planning, comes down to your board and governance, and how that trickles down to your stakeholders and things like steercos on programs and projects.
Okay, thank you, Duke. Sanjiv, I would love to know your thoughts.
I really look at strategy as a big topic that has sub-strategies within it. So for example, we can talk about corporate strategy, the business strategy, and the technical strategy as the kind of hierarchy that we need to talk about in this discussion. So from a corporate strategy perspective, that's really set at the top level, the board of directors, and they empower the CEO to implement that corporate strategy along with the executive team. The business strategy kind of derives out of the corporate strategy, and it can be 2 years, 5 years, typically between 2 and 5 years long. And it really talks about how the business is moving forward and ideally into a greater success. The technical strategy has to dovetail the business strategy. So if we know what the business strategy is doing in the next 2 to 5 years with the customer base, the geography, the number of resources, the level of automation, the technical strategy would be a roadmap that would dovetail along with the goalposts of the business strategy itself. Now, what's interesting today in the last couple of years is previously it was really a one-way street. Here's a business strategy, how's a technical strategy going to enable that piece or those activities. Today now, knowing what technology can do, that actually can feed the business strategy. So it's really talking about who's sitting at the table. So typically you have the C-suite, the CIO, the CDO, the chief digital officer, chief security officer, and a number of other related IT roles would be at that table working with the business leadership to feed the levels of strategy and driving those forward together. But they're definitely related, and the business strategy is typically the one on top, but heavily dependent and driven by the technology pieces.
Okay. And you've probably seen in your career many examples of programs that you ran or programs that you've perhaps, witnessed but wasn't directly involved with or heard about. So I'd love a good story or a successful program that you've seen in your career, a very successful one, and on the other hand, a very unsuccessful or failure of a program delivery? So Duke, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to say most of the programs I've worked on have led to success. I think the caveat is, some projects fail for lots of reasons, and there are always going to be those cases. Successful, I would say there's a number I could point to. I think when I was at Magellan, that's the company I started with my brother. We had initiated a program with Industry Canada, actually, that did the first, and it sounds a little odd now, but we did the first rollout of something around microbes and measuring how those affect health. And the reason I'm mentioning that one is because it was groundbreaking, and it got some attention on CNN at that time. It was a little geeky for sure, because a lot of people wouldn't think that kind of program as being something super important to them. But as time went on, it did become more important. People got more interested in things like, at that time, it was molds and things that would affect your health in the home and other things in the workplace. So we had developed methodologies that were rolled out for measuring those microbes and the health effects around that. So that was leading to a number of projects for creating products and services that would mitigate risk around those microbes. So that's an example. The same company, with some of the offshore oil and gas. So, the big multi-billion-dollar projects often are super risky. A lot of times there's things you can't control. So I mentioned some of the root cause risk that we did. It was very quantitative risk. So you would actually have to quantify what the likelihood of an event was. And we use things like HAZOP, which is a very technical way to say, what if? And some of the software we developed, measured that impact. And it was able to be used in a way that prevented some of those catastrophic events from happening. And that was the whole objective of that program. And still some of those methodologies are being used in some of the software that we developed. And I think the other thing that I would say successfully came out of that is iteratively we developed software for the financial services market around risk. And a lot of that's around trading risk and things like Monte Carlo simulation would be an example, and value at risk. And a lot of that kind of software led me into the banks, and that's how I ended up in Microsoft, being in the worldwide financial services group, and later at RBC and other banks. So those are examples of successes. Examples of failure. I mean, I'm not going to point to any one company for failures, because I think statistically the number of projects that fail depends on how you measure them, right? So one of the ones that I worked on was around regulatory compliance during the financial crisis. And I would say it was a failure before I took it on. So I don't think I owned that, but it was a program that was directed by the regulator around, and you might know that the Dodd-Frank term during the financial crisis, they developed new capital requirements for banks and new ways to measure liquidity risk management. And a lot of the banks failed out of the gate to do it properly. And I think a lot of the projects just kind of got put on hold, or really just kind of didn't succeed. And I think that's where, and Sanjiv's written books about this, but turnaround comes in. So you may inherit a project that's a failure, and you may decide that and you may get a mandate from the business to say, let's turn that project around because we have to. We don't have a choice. We have to do liquidity risk management. We're regulated. We have to do it. And there's an opportunity to make a success out of something that's not gone well. The trouble, and I've seen this recently in programs I mentioned around PayMod, and almost universally those programs have failed out of the gate. And I think it's really a lesson learned, is making sure you get the right stakeholders, the right mandate, the right charters, and very, very carefully select the right partners, and to deliver the program. And if you don't, it's not that you can't turn it around. It's just going to be harder to do that. And you may have restrictions, right? You may have capital that's run out. You may have budget increases that have to happen. You may have to rebaseline and start over again almost. And that's okay, because if the program is absolutely a must-do, like a regulatory project, or something that you need to modernize to be able to participate in the financial system, those are things that you can't avoid, so eventually you're going to have to do it, whatever the cost, whatever the time. And you may, like I say, have vendor agreements that aren't favorable. You might have huge, overruns in budget. You may have risk reviews that say you're way beyond the risk appetite. That's all going to be important, but it's not going to be material in the long run. You have to do the program and figure out a way to get it done.
Okay, thanks for sharing. I think part of what you kind of implied is that definition of what success and what failure is. And personally, I find that what it comes down to is really around expectations. Have you met certain expectations? I find that some organizations articulate, those expectations with, for example, their OKRs. They would have a set of key results saying, this is how we would measure success for this objective, or a set of KPIs for a program. I think part of it is maybe the expectations from the get-go were either not realistic or you didn't have the right people to deliver on the expectations. But I wanted to hear from Sanjiv, your thoughts.
I've actually run several practices where we would be engaged by different clients to come and review programs or projects and give a health check on them. And so it would be like a dashboard of what's going well, what needs more attention, and how to kind of recover or drive more business value. So it's something that I'm very close to. And I've seen common themes of successful programs, either that I've managed or I've seen other people manage, or as part of the practice that we review different projects. I'll give you an example. Like in the financial industry, there was a large ERP implementation that was failing. And it was failing because of scope creep. So every time, testing started, the business would find more things to do, more things to add. And that takes on a life of its own. And so the timeline kept getting extended. So when we took it, so we looked at that program and we made various changes around prioritization and governance so that the scope creep would stop. We created a critical path, which was a minimal viable product, to say, this is what absolutely, will be equivalent and needed for implementation. And then anything that isn't included in that set, it may be very important, but it would be day 2, day 3, and subsequent to that. We also made other changes in terms of management on the stream, accelerated some of the testing, accelerated some of the data validation. So we really looked at a number of elements in the program. I think there were about 20 dimensions in total. And we made adjustments. And within about a year, I think it was just over a year, we implemented, went live, and won a couple of awards for the program. And it was really that all those pieces having to work together, knowing where to look and how to drive that engagement from the business and the staff. And I think you mentioned something about KPIs. That was actually very vital. It allowed us to cut through the noise of what absolutely needed to be in the critical path. And we came up with about 8 KPIs. And by ensuring that we met those, we could make the decision on how functionality would be prioritized and move forward. And another key element of every successful program I've seen is it's got OCM, Organizational Change Management. It's all about communication to the users, ensuring that they are engaged, that they're trained up, that they're ready, and that they're excited about a system well in advance. On the unsuccessful side, I think part of it is definition. How do we define unsuccessful? Is it one thing? Is it we've gone over budget? Is it that we've added a couple of months to the deadline? But typically it would be a combination of a program that's way over budget, that is beyond the tolerance the organization can accept, that the deadline is severely beyond any contingency that was set, or that major functionality was not delivered. Major business functionality was not delivered. There's other things though. You could actually go live. You can be in budget. You can be within the functionality that is required. However, the architecture could be very expensive to maintain, and the system may not have the resilience that it needs. So defining success and lack of success, it's a little bit more complicated. But if we take the definitions of over budget, severely over budget, missing deadlines, and not having all the functionality, it's a couple of projects that I've reviewed that come to mind. And again, the common theme that I would say is unrealistic expectations and lack of proper governance. So let me just describe what those mean. So unrealistic expectations, and they begin by, words that would be said on a program somewhere, which would be like, we just want to do what we used to do, but make it better. So very vague statements. And at the beginning of a program, there may be some expectations of what that means, but every stakeholder is going to think something differently. And so if there is not a good understanding of what the requirements are and what the KPIs are, the expectations can become very unrealistic. And that's really a spiral downwards. The other one is the kind of lack of governance. And there has to be a common way of allocating responsibility, accountability, and resolution and escalations to make key decisions. There are other things I've seen on programs as well. One of the tools that I use and that I would recommend, I've seen a lot of other people use, is to have warning flags in their programs so that the methodology is built out to say, I expect to see certain things at these points. As soon as I trigger an early warning flag, I know there's a problem. So I need to make an adjustment or an intervention. And if those are done properly, it really enhances the success of programs and projects substantially.
Thanks for sharing. Lots of great insights. I was taking notes on misalignment on expectations. I think that's a very common one. And unrealistic expectations and misalignment kind of go hand in hand. Basically having a number of stakeholders traveling with maybe a different definition of what is to be accomplished or what goal they have. And you also mentioned, kind of reminded me of this acronym of FLOP, which is failure due to launch, ops, or premise. And I think a lot of time it's the premise. It's people don't really care about the thing that you're building, or the idea or the concept might not be as useful as you think it may be. So lots of interesting nuggets there. I don't know if you both heard about the McKinsey study on trash in New York, and how I think it was the city that spent 1.6 million on I think they took about 20 weeks studying the best way to collect trash. Have you heard about this one?
I haven't heard about that one.
No, I have not heard of that.
I find it very interesting. I was just reading about it recently, and I guess the conclusion they came up with is trash bags should be placed in trash bins rather than be left on the street, which was an interesting conclusion to spend, this amount of time and money to arrive at. For me, it's that kind of example of, a lot of the things that you were saying, unrealistic or misaligned expectations, going over budget, and perhaps even misalignment on the problem and elements of lack of governance. We're going to take a short break, and when we're back, I'll be asking you about enterprise program trends, and we'll go from there. Hey there, my amazing product people. If you're trying to find your own story with product, design, and leadership, gain a new perspective on being human in a soulless corporate world, and possibly have a good laugh in the process, you can grab your very own copy of my latest book, Product People, A Journal of Laughter and Tears. It's available on Amazon in all formats right now. Happy reading. All right, let's continue where we left off. I wanted to ask you about enterprise program trends. So Duke, I'll start with you. What do you think are the most common programs you've seen in the last 3 years? And what do you think programs in the next 3 to 5 years are going to be about?
Yeah, in the industry I most, concentrate on is banking, financial services, fintech. And not surprisingly, a lot of programs are being driven by regulatory compliance. And I'll give you a few examples, like fraud would be one. I think in a lot of cases, as we modernize, you're seeing legacy systems that were not, contemplating some of the complexity of fraud, how it occurs in payments, and even things like mortgage lending and things like that. There's always opportunities for fraud. There always has been, but I think they're becoming complex and risky. So I think more and more of those programs will start to involve AI and using tools around insights for, identifying fraud in real time as we get into real-time payments and real-time transactions. Open banking is another example. So, this is where you draw with APIs different views of different accounts. And it could be on one pane of glass, you're looking at all your accounts. A lot of that also opens up opportunities for cyber. And so the countermeasures are really programs around becoming more sophisticated with your data, modernizing your systems. And a lot of times we're talking about cloud to be able to do AI. A lot of the data is now residing in the cloud, or if on premise, it's also having to be secured against some of these new threat vectors like AI. And then I think more or less how banking is rolling out things around compliance. You've seen some of the examples. I won't name the banks that have been fined in a lot of it's related to compliance and how they actually roll out compliance programs, anti-money laundering programs, things like that. So I think you're going to see more and more of those programs. We're already seeing some of these financial institutions hiring new teams to do that kind of work. Years gone by, that wasn't so popular. I think it was kind of a back office second thought. now it's kind of front of mind. I think talking about AI, I think more or less the core of whether you're financial services or your energy or your retail, it doesn't really matter. I think everyone has some programs and projects around AI, whether it's just experimental or, kind of hedging against what could be a threat. If other competitors start to become really good and that, ends up being a huge differentiator or very disruptive to their business, I think they have to play. There's some skepticism for sure. Like there's those that, and I think it's good to be skeptical because, as you know, all new technology, it kind of gets hyped. And, I think we're kind of hitting the trough of disillusionment on some of that. And at the same time, you can't afford to not play in that space. I think you have to do, data. You have to make sure it's secure. You have to make sure it's being used for the right purposes to give you insights and to provide value to your customers. So those are the ones that are top of mind.
Okay. Sanjiv, I'd love to hear from you about looking at the past 3 years or so and also looking into the future on topics of programs.
Yeah, I think in the past couple of years, I'm seeing a lot of ERP, CRM, and HR system implementations. These are the SAPs, the Salesforce, the Workdays, and the others, just to name a few. But I've seen a lot of those implementations. A lot of talk about data analytics and what that can do for an organization. Focus on kind of business transformation supported by digital transformation and looking for areas that can be further automated, further improved, more insight gained from the systems themselves. We are in an interesting, really place though in the industry right now. There's a lot of AI discussions and there's a lot of questions around what exactly can AI do? How will it be rolled out? And what is true AI? Like a lot of things are being referred to as AI, which really are not, in my opinion, AI. They're just some kind of machine learning or process automation to a certain extent. So I think the future is really going to be the right sizing AI to work to be used in certain parts of a business for improvements there. I think there's still a lot of need for humans in the equation. I don't see that going away anytime soon. So I think the next couple of years is going to see several things. One is a heavier reliance on data analytics and getting insight out of data, true insight out of data, and predictive analytics to look at what can be done in the future based on what's been done in the past. There are going to be a lot of upgrades to legacy ERP, CRM, HRM systems. I think that work is being bottled up and it's going to come out. The needs are going to come out in the near future. There are still a lot of legacy systems that will need to be upgraded and maintained first, but then upgraded. And then I think the other thing that I'm seeing major emphasis on is cyber. So every industry is protecting your data and ensuring that it's safe. It's not just an IT initiative. It's an corporate initiative. And there are a lot of weak points, a lot of factors that have to be addressed in cyber. And that is going to be a major focus.
Speaking of AI, and you both mentioned some examples relating to the craft of program delivery. If I'm a program manager or a program lead, do you think organizations and people within the profession of program management will change how they do things, how they approach program delivery with advanced AI?
The roles are changing. Elsawe, I think in my experience, that's a slow process. We embraced Agile about 10 years ago. It's been around a lot longer than that, but more or less the banks started to think about new ways to deliver value. And one of the concepts was this Agile. Everyone had a different understanding of what that meant. I think a lot of times they thought, well, that's just making things faster, but it actually changes the roles quite a lot. So in the case I'm talking about, 8-10 years ago, there was no concept of, about Scrum or some of the stuff around product ownership, what's the role? In fact, there wasn't really a lot of a product mindset itself on how those got delivered. And I think as we start to integrate things like cloud and data and new ways to work, I think Agile's been quasi-successful. Some of it ended up being iterative Agile and some of it ended up being fragile, meaning it just, was Agile by name, not by actual delivery. And I think that's good learning. I think that the next step is what do you do about the future? what kind of methodologies do we need to use to deliver the same capabilities we did 10 years ago, but at a faster and higher value output. And some of the ones that I would point to, like in my experience, would be automation. We did DevOps, which for those that don't know is taking kind of a slow way to develop software, like Sanjiv was talking about, the SDLC or the software development lifecycle, that usually would have been pretty linear, and automating steps in it. So each step could be taking things that would have been manual, including things like how the code gets integrated, how the code gets released. And most software companies are quite familiar in this kind of methodology, and they release software quite a lot. They add features, and banks are not used to doing that, right? An insurance company. So a lot of times they would release a product maybe once per year, and that would be ambitious sometimes. Now they could, in some cases, if they've automated some of that process and are able to test and release much more rapidly, they could release whenever they like. That creates innovation, and it also changes the roles, like I mentioned. So now people that might have been used to doing things one way have to do it a different way. My first, experience with how this gets adopted wasn't the greatest. So people resist the kind of change. They want to do it the old way, and they can't. So over a period of 4 or 5 years, I was working with developers, thousands of them, and they were resisting. But at the same time, they started to embrace some of these new tools and technologies, some of the automated ways to test and release. Some of the tools now are quite familiar. Everybody probably knows GitHub and, some of the things like Jenkins that let you do some of this automation. But at the end of the day, it's a process and it takes time. And I think we're not done. So even if this ends up being successful in some of the ways that we develop products, I think it's still far from end of job. And we still have this combination of old ways, like the traditional way to do software development, and the more modern ways to do it. And it'll take, probably another decade. And I would say it's the same for AI or any of these new things. So yes, there's lots and lots of AI in the banks and other financial institutions, but they're still experimenting to a certain extent. So they're able to take data, they're able to clean the data, they're able to provide new tools and insights into some of their products. And I think that's all good. But the disruptive, massive change that this is, I guess, going to produce will take probably longer than most people think.
I see. Sanjiv, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the impact of AI for program delivery.
Yeah, I think one of the big impacts is knowing how and where to use AI effectively. So there are parts of the methodologies, program delivery methodologies, where I think AI will play a meaningful role in the near future. But I think teams are going to have to understand what's reasonable and what's doable versus what's a much, much future, as Duke is saying, a distant future or even like a longer term future where the capabilities will be there. So I think there's going to be impacts on how AI is used within a methodology. So our methodologies will have to get adjusted to accommodate the AI. Architecture will be very important to see how AI components live within that architecture and how they're going to evolve. And I think we're still at the early stages. We don't know what the impact is on longer term maintenance, on DevOps. How are these systems, what systems can be self-monitoring, what needs manual intervention, where and how, the whole measurement of success from AI, what that would look like. So I think there's a lot of work still needing to be done on how we can incorporate AI into our larger programs. But that's coming. That's definitely coming.
Yeah, I've definitely seen some experiments, at least on the Gen AI side, tools that would help you fill a program charter better or faster, writing things like PRDs or product briefs, but also some startups playing in the space of, smart insights and being intelligent around monitoring your program and how it's running and giving you some of those flags, as you mentioned earlier. I haven't seen something that's, to both of your point, widely successful or stable yet, but I think it's definitely part of the process. But there's definitely some applications that are showing up in different places. So that's promising. I wanted to talk about people, and you both spoke about roles. Duke, I remember you mentioned how roles are going to change and how roles change in the past, resistance to change in general. I think if we look at the number of the challenges that exist, especially in North America right now, I want to first hear from you. What do you think are top challenges for organizations when it comes to innovation, when they're trying to innovate right now, given this landscape? And then I'll move on to people from there. But Duke, we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I mean, innovation is always a challenge, I think, especially for traditional organizations. I think for the most part, until probably about 10 years ago, most in the financial services industry, at least, would be laggards in innovation. I'm not saying they don't innovate, they do. And in fact, look at the credit union space. They were the first to do a lot of things like ATMs. And I would even say the first to bring on women as clients. They were the first to do that. But they've kind of let, innovation sit on the back burner. So I think more or less in the last 10 years, though, it's been a good story. So the one I would point to in the case of where I was working is they discovered that, hey, if we don't do this, some of these upstarts are going to eat our lunch, right? And they were picking off pieces of the value chain and starting fintechs, right? And I think the threat at first was overblown a little bit because banks in particular, they thought, okay, what if these people can do it cheaper and they don't have to actually live with the regulatory environment that we have to deal with? Or what if they are able to do things on technology platforms in the cloud that we can't because we were stuck on the legacy mainframe and things like that. And I think that's become less of a threat for them, but at the same time, they had to start to innovate internally and start to create their own ability to modernize. So that's been a good news story. So that's why you've seen these things around so-called big data analytics that Sanjiv was talking about, things like cloud, and that doesn't mean everything has to go into the cloud. That's not what they're saying. They're just creating the ability in some cases to make things in the cloud that would be cheaper, faster, better. And that includes DevOps, that includes automation of the product development lifecycle, things like that. But I think innovation internally has been more deliberate. So they've created sometimes things like ecosystems where they could take a team, put them in, an isolated, from the organization structure perspective, isolated location physically, and also abstract them from all the sort of things that you would normally have to report in on in a bank, and create almost like a startup environment and experiment with new things, so maybe better ways to loan money, things like, new services and products that you might want to offer to a different segment, like maybe it's immigrants or maybe it's the real estate market in terms of housing, or a different demographic, a younger crowd that may not come to the traditional bank, for example. So these are new channels and new opportunities. So there is a lot of innovation happening there, but it's also, I guess, some of the gotchas, things like, some of that innovation could be more theater, what they call innovation theater. I mean, they're investing, they're doing some cool things. They're using modern ways to do the development like DevOps and even things like Agile, but there's no outcome and there's never going to be. There's some examples of that. Or things like I was involved with blockchain, one of the first ones to be involved with it. So there was some very high expectations, and then, things like cross-border payments with Ripple and Ethereum and so on and so on. But a lot of that kind of got blown out of proportion, and then they kind of put it on the back burner, right? So they don't necessarily want to lead the innovation of around blockchain. They'll let someone else do that, but they don't want to ignore it either. So I think innovation itself has to be deliberate. It has to be strategic. I do think there's some really good examples. I'm going to say RPC because they did a fantastic job, in my opinion. At Microsoft, they were my customer. To when I actually worked there and how they evolved, I think, shows that they're increasingly becoming more of an innovation lab in a lot of ways for financial services. But they have the same friction around regulatory compliance, around competition, around, a bit of the relief they get from being in Canada. It's a bit of a walled garden, right? So I think they're not going to be maybe the cutting edge of innovation, but they'll definitely be leading from a Canadian perspective and investing, which is great.
All right. Thank you, Duke. Sanjiv, I'd love to know your thoughts. Top challenges for organizations when trying to innovate in North America.
I think it's really coming up with the right use case that's going to be meaningful, doable within achievable within a certain timeline, and then will lead into other use cases for an organization. It's the understanding what the possible is rather than what the desire is. So we may want some part of technology to be operating at a certain level. It just may not be ready, and it may not be ready for years. And so I think it's that overreaching too soon. I think some decisions are going to have to be made at the business level in terms of what is achievable today versus waiting for new improvements to be available before starting. I'll go back to cyber. I think cyber is probably one of the biggest things we all need to be concerned about in IT, and securing our systems from all levels. And then the other one will be also taking advantage of the data analytics. What can data analytics be used for? There's a lot of use cases that will benefit the bottom line, and having a program and the proper governance around using data analytics will drive profitability and new markets for a lot of organizations.
Okay. And if we switch gears to people, I mean, if you look at LinkedIn alone as an example, it's very clear that it's challenging times for a lot of professionals in tech. And a lot of product people in the industry may feel this sense of hopelessness. There's lots of layoffs, there's rising cost of living. And just given your stories and your experience, your expertise, I'd love to know from both of you, what advice can you offer them? And Duke, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm concerned for sure. I've got young daughters. What's their future look like? To your point, I think it's not, unique to Canada or even to product or even to technology. I think it's universal around the world. Cost of living has gone up. Lots of ththings like housing is just unaffordable in the bigger cities for young people. That concerns me. I mean, you want ideally to be where we were probably 20 years ago when you can get a good role somewhere and have a decent living and be able to afford a house in the place that you're living in. That's not the case. Right. So that may not ever change now. I think it may be, for the bigger cities anyway, very, very difficult. But I'm not pessimistic. I'm optimistic, actually. And I think those people that choose to be in a product role, are, they go through cycles, as you know. Like there's been times when you could really get any role you want, pretty much. And now there's lots of people that are on the street, right? They're not able to get a role. I think it's temporary. I think I'm very, very confident, especially if you have skills that line up with some of the new things that are happening around data or things around software development, even though it's new ways to do it. I think there's hundreds and hundreds of jobs that you can go after, right? So, and some of them may involve moving, no doubt, if you're willing to move to the right place. I think that's a good thing. I did the digital talent strategy at a big bank. And at that time, the idea was a lot of the roles were changing. So things like product owner, scrum master that we talked about, data scientist, and it was super exciting. Agile coach, these were things that never existed before. But the problem was, the skills in the existing bank at that point did not line up with those the supply and demand of those roles. So we had to think about how do you do it. So one way we had to do it was compete with tech companies, right, like Microsoft, Google, and that meant higher pay, right? And at the same time, there would never be enough supply. So there was a lot of appetite to upskill, and so those people that may have had skills that are slowly, I guess not meeting the demand and the supply, could upskill and become a scrum master or a product owner or whatever it might be. And I think that still exists. So if you're coming out of school and getting discouraged right now, it's temporary. I think there's going to be plenty of opportunity. I think in fact, I wish I was super young again, because it would be another renaissance of technology with what's happening with data and analytics and AI and things like that. So yeah, very, very confident. And I think young people, they'll see that as time goes on. You learn, it takes time, but everything's cyclical. Everything is leading to a different outcome in the future, but it's all positive in my opinion.
Thank you, Duke. Sanjiv, what about your advice?
Yeah, I think the market is cyclical. I think we've gone through a period of post-COVID. The inflation had gone up extensively. Interest rates have been raised very quickly. So I think macroeconomic factors are affecting the industry, both the IT industry and beyond the IT industry. But I think a lot of demand is being captured, like it's being halted right now, but it's bubbling up. And there's going to have to be a lot of system upgrades. There's a lot of work that hasn't been completed and being put on hold. That should start to reemerge over the next few months. I think a lot of organizations have been in a bit of a holding strategy to see where interest rates are going to go. So they are coming down a little bit. So that should also increase the opportunity for investments again. So my advice right now is going through personal network. So I wouldn't just rely on what's posted. I think it's very important to go through people, to talk to people we know. Maybe they've heard of something, maybe something hasn't been posted yet, and there's positions out there. So there is work out there. It takes longer for decisions to be made, and there's just a lot more people looking at the same time because of concurrent layoffs, especially in some of the bigger cities. But as history shows, these are cyclical, and it will be corrected probably before the end of this year, I would think. Q4.
I hope so. All right. Sanjiv, for this one, I'll start with you again. And I wanted to ask you, is there a specific cause, topic, or anything else you're passionate about and would like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, no, I just helping the homeless, helping underserved communities. I think I'm just very passionate about raising money, helping, volunteering. There's lots of good organizations, both that support the local communities and help the local homeless. But for people interested overseas, there's lots of organizations that help specific parts of the world also improve. So that's something I really find satisfying. And I also volunteer on various other volunteer boards as well.
Thank you for sharing. Duke, what about yourself?
My big one, I think, has always been, women in technology. That would be one, so supporting women. My observation is, when I entered the tech industry, especially at Microsoft and companies like that, it wasn't that there weren't any women, there were, but it was relatively small. And oftentimes they were in things like marketing, sales, even if they were engineers. So I've been, kind of passionate about promoting women in technology. And of course, I've got 3 daughters. One of them studied physics. 2 of them are still deciding what they want to do. I'm trying to hope they go into technology because I think it's a super great area. And I think the other part of that is, young people. So, a lot of the volunteer work I've done had to do with helping young people in their careers, as a mentor, sponsoring them, helping them get trained up in things that they were passionate about. Some of that, bleeds over to startups. I've always helped a lot of startups, not exclusively women, but or young people. But I've helped a lot of kind of young people get started and continue to do a lot of that. And I would also say, your question earlier is very much around that and what's coming, right? No one has a crystal ball, and the past doesn't necessarily mean everything's going to be the same as what I experience or Sanjiv experience or you experience. But it's a strong indicator, in the industry because we've been in it so long that we have some feeling for what could happen. And I remain really positive. So I think I'll continue to help and volunteer and mentor.
Thank you both. And Duke, I'll start with you on this one. But finally, for those that are interested in learning more about your work and connecting with you, how can they do so?
Yeah, I'm the easiest to find because there's not that many Duke Butlers in the world. I'm on LinkedIn, just search for my name. There's, stuff that we're doing like this. There's stuff I do in the industry, like presenting at different conferences and so forth. You'll see my name out there. But I'm always approachable and try to help where I can. So right now I'm doing a lot of work around consulting, but in the past I've been doing quite a lot of senior roles. So it's traveling, it's time consuming, but I still always try and find time to help people where I can.
Thank you, Duke. And Sanjiv, yourself?
Yeah, similarly, I'm on LinkedIn. I think I'm the only, I haven't seen another person with my name on there. So happy to engage in conversations, questions, or helping with introductions to opportunities that, where they exist and that I'm aware of them.
Duke and Sanjiv, this conversation was practical, insightful, and informative. And I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on the Product People podcast.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Alsawe. Thank you so much.
I'm grateful to Duke and Sanjiv for sharing their wholesome insights on applied enterprise program delivery. We spoke about what makes for successful programs, the connection between programs and strategy, and how product people can deliver value during a challenging job market. I found their insights to be practical, contextual, and meaningful, and I hope you did too. I want to express my gratitude to all our listeners. Your support means the world to me. If you found today's episode valuable, please hit subscribe, leave a review, or share this podcast with your friends. I also encourage you to share your feedback and your ideas on what topics you'd like to hear about next on this podcast. Your input is very important as it helps me learn and improve. Stay tuned for more exciting episodes, and until next time, stay courageous, creative, and compassionate. Take care.